So the question of secondary occupation is one of the topics we discussed at the conference today. Colombia, I understand, is struggling quite significantly at this moment with this issue, and it's an issue which other countries, other post-conflict states have dealt with quite considerably as well. The Pinero principles on housing and property restitution for refugees and internally displaced persons that were passed in 2005 by the United Nations General Assembly deal with this question, but they make very clear that secondary occupiers' rights are simply rights of due process and human rights relating to access to housing. They are not property rights in the land that they're occupying. The Pinero principles do talk about secondary occupation from a procedural standpoint, but that's all. That, I think, has been challenged in some ways in a number of jurisdictions recently. I think after those principles were passed, there was a real move towards that kind of a bright line approach, and that's one that we see coming out of Bosnia and Kosovo. What we start to see now is that doesn't always work, that it doesn't necessarily align with the realities in a particular post-conflict situation. We heard a lot today about even how every individual case is different, and even more so every conflict zone, every country that has gone through this is different, and so there has to be some flexibility. And what some jurisdictions have struggled with, as Colombia, I understand, is now, is to what degree do we recognize the rights of secondary occupiers as being a property right as well, or to what degree does the passage of time mean that we come to a point where there should be a recognition of the rights of some secondary occupiers, and what do we do with that? Does that mean that in some cases secondary occupiers stay in the property where they are? Does it mean that there has to be a compensation payable to go with that? Are there other alternatives we can look at, like things like land sharing, for example? How do we go about recognizing that there may be two sets of rights that are both to be recognized? My own experience is in particular in Kosovo, after the end of the conflict there in 2000, there was a peace agreement which, among other things, recognized the right of refugees and IDPs to return to their homes and the right to have their property restituted to them. And there too, the focus was clearly on restitution in kind, that is returning the pre-conflict properties to the pre-conflict owners. Very little attention was paid to secondary occupiers from a property rights perspective. There was an evictions process that took place. There was a whole department set up within the United Nations administration to deal with evictions. They were not always successful in terms of being peaceful. And I think one of the problems that I saw there was that when you take this sort of narrow restitution process out of the context of a larger sort of development of respect for property rights in a post-conflict scenario, people don't necessarily understand, there's no culture change that takes place with that. And so we were hearing of cases, for example, where people would be evicted from the home that they were occupying, but then a few days later would be going back to the Housing and Property Directorate to ask for keys for that place because they saw it was still sitting empty. They wanted back in, or would go and occupy somewhere else. It wasn't a change of culture, and I think that's part of what we have to look at. This is not just about restitution. It's about respect for property rights. It's about certainty in property rights, so that as we move forward, or as a post-conflict society moves forward, economic development can take place as well.